call upon Chris Alford. He is the head of the sponsorship team, and he will give you a brief introduction onto who internally displaced people are and about the community that we're helping.
Thanks very much, and I'd like to extend my thanks as well, as Secretary said, to everyone that's made it here tonight. It's very, very nice to see so many people supporting our project. Today I'd just like to sort of give a background to the problem that the project leader has decided to dedicate its energy and its resources to. And that problem is internal displacement, and in particular internal displacement in Colombia. The objectives of the talk I'm going to give you today is that, first of all, I'd just like to outline how we define internally displaced people, and then I'm going to provide you a background to the global crisis of internal displacement, and then examine the situation faced by internally displaced people in Colombia. And I'd like to use the example of the Iberachami indigenous community, who are the community we're working with, as sort of an example, for me they're the perfect example of the problems that internally displaced people face, not only in Colombia, but around the world. Now, firstly, who is an internally displaced person? I think the easiest way to define it is through the United Nations definitions, who defines it as persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict situations or of generalised violence, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognised state border. Now, that last sentence is the most important sentence of that definition there, because it's essentially how it distinguishes internally displaced people from refugees. Refugees are people that have to leave their homes according to similar conditions as internally displaced people, but they have not crossed an internationally recognised border. And because of this, refugees have actually been given a legal status under the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which in this status essentially entitles them to certain rights, and it entitles them to aid and entitles them to protection within the international community. But the essential problem with internal displacement is that these people don't actually have these rights, and they're not legally entitled to the same rights that refugees are. And this is a particular problem because, as you can see from this table here, which is from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, the number of IDPs in the world has actually surpassed the number of refugees in the world over the past few years, and it's nearly double the amount of internally displaced people now in the world than there are refugees. And these figures are from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, which is actually the only organisation in the world which is solely dedicated to the problem of internal displacement. There are lots of organisations that are dedicated to helping refugees around the world, for example, Refugees International. But the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre is actually the only one that is solely dedicated to helping internal displacement. And not only that, its primary purpose is not to help internally displaced people, but to provide data and information on internally displaced people, which is an especially difficult task because they are not internationally recognised like refugees. And this is another table from 2005. Which shows you the internally displaced people around the world, again, from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. So essentially, internal displaced people, they do need a special category because they do suffer exactly the same problems that refugees suffer. And as well, it's very difficult to discern exactly how many people have been displaced. There's lack of identification documents, and many of these people, they lack access to international aid organisations. And so their protection and assistance have yet to be met properly. I'd like to talk about internal displacement in Colombia. Colombia is actually got one of the worst internally displaced problems in the world. It's actually second to only Sudan in terms of its internal displaced population. In 2007, 320,000 people were displaced in 1 year. And in the first quarter of 2008, actually saw the highest rate of displacement for 23 years. So this is a problem that's clearly not going away in Colombia, and it's one that's actually getting worse as the 21st century progresses. And Colombia is a prime example of why you need a special recognition of internally displaced people, because there's such a wide such a wide number of statistics as to how many internally displaced people there are actually in Colombia. The IDMC estimates around 4 million, whereas the United Nations Refugee Agency has recognised at least 3 million. But only 2.3 million of these internally displaced people are actually recognised by the Colombian government, and these are the only people that are actually receiving official aid from the Colombian government. Essentially, you can, when you're talking about displacement in Colombia, you can narrow it down to these three courses. Obviously, it's quite wider than this, but I'm only going to give you a short summary. Colombia has experienced over 40 years of armed conflict between left-wing guerrilla groups and right-wing paramilitary organizations and the Colombian army. The two prominent rebel groups in Colombia are the FARC and the ELN. The FARC is Colombia's largest rebel group, and it was established in 1964. In 2001, it had roughly around 16,000 members. It operates in around 1/3 of the country, mostly in the jungles of the south. And it is from these areas in the south of the country that so many rural inhabitants have been ousted, as the land is then given over to the cultivation of cocaine or for other ways to raise money for the FARC. Experts estimate that the FARC actually takes between 200 million and 300 million annually, at least half of its income from the illegal drug trade. And it also profits from kidnappings, extortion schemes, and an unofficial tax that it levies on the countryside's population and social services. On the other side of the conflict, you have the paramilitary groups, and most notably the United Self-Defense Force of Colombia, who have also been responsible for displacing thousands of people from their land as the two groups compete over resources, the cocaine industry, and power. As well, the United Self-Defense Forces are estimated to receive around 70% of their income from the cocaine trade. Negotiations with the Colombian government meant that the forces of the paramilitary were supposedly demobilized in 2006. But recent reports from Amnesty International and also from Human Rights Watch have shown that this has actually not been the case, and they still have a very strong force in the country, and they still continue to be responsible for numerous cases of human rights violations. And so it is between this conflict that internally displaced people and indeed much of the rural population of Colombia have been caught. All sides of the conflict have accused local communities of collaborating with the others. For example, they're accused of hiding members of the FARC or the United Self-Defense Forces, or they're accused of being members of either one of the forces. And this is often followed with violent retribution. And so they often have to flee to try and escape this violence. Many communities have actually tried to set up humanitarian zones in Colombia with international support. And all these communities ask is that the warring factions respect their neutrality and recognise that they do not want to be involved in the conflict. And yet, these actual humanitarian zones have actually become prime targets of the rebel forces. And violence against the leaders of these human rights advocates and social workers have ranged from intimidation to full-scale massacres of innocent communities. Another reason why internally displaced people are forced to flee their homes is that a lot of the forces around in Colombia will try to forcibly enlist members of communities into their ranks. And this is also the case for children. Human Rights Watch actually estimates that more than 11,000 children fight in Colombia's armed conflict, which is one of the highest totals in the world. At least 1 of every 4 irregular combatants in Colombia is under the age of 18, and several thousand of them are under the age of 50, the minimum age permitted for recruitment into the armed forces under the Geneva Convention. So many communities are forced to flee their homes in order to escape this, and this is of particular importance for Project Ayuda, because the community that we're currently working with, the Barachami indigenous community, actually was suffered from this, and the reason why they had to flee from their homes the last time they fled was because the rebel forces threatened to enlist their children and their men into their ranks. Once children are enlisted into the ranks, they're often ordered to